Hello, in this video I'm looking at UVLayout and how to set up a pivot object. Okay, so there's our mesh. Let's just look at the UVs. So what I mean by a pivot object, let's have a look at just rotating those shells. So let's select them, hold space, left mouse button. So by default, it'll select the center of that selection, so you can see the little circle and cross there. So that's the default location. If I have under the go to move, scale, rotate, click on shell here, you can select pinned. So when that's enabled, if I have a point pinned, so I've just used P key to pin that point, then that becomes, any pinned points become the pivot for that rotation or scale. Okay, so that works, but if you want your pivot somewhere else that's not where a point is, then it's you can't do that in the current version, so you'll need to set up a pivot object. Okay, so I'll show you how to do that. So all you need really is just a quad. Now, the easiest way to do it is, let's say I cut off a bit of geometry here, set that up, make it a rectangle. So that's my pivot object. The problem with that, of course, is I've just cut that out of the geometry. So we don't really want to do that. What I'll do though is make a copy of that. So there's no way to quickly make a direct copy, but I can just select it. So I've selected that quad, go save marked. I'll save it into an OBJ file, so it'll just save that one quad into the OBJ file, and I can import that. Okay, so it's just showing me that it's there. I don't really care too much where it is in the 3D scene. So the default location will do, but what I do need to do is I'll create a new layer for it. So then it's easy to sort of pick it separately from the rest of the geometry and just manage things more nicely. So I'll create a new layer. So that's under layers here, create a new layer, call it pivot. So whenever I create a new layer, it automatically becomes the active one. So then when I add that to the scene, this imported geometry, I'll add it to just that pivot layer. Okay, so it's in there, but I'm not really too fussed about where it is in the 3D view. It's the UV view that I need to know where it is. So if I click on this button here, that will select just the pivot shell. Then I can use space middle mouse button here, or just use home. So that'll zoom the view to where that pivot object is. Right, so first thing I need to do is make that into a perfect rectangle, so that's just R key. And then I use Shift P, so that will pin each corner. So then when I use that as the pivot, because I've picked 4 corners, it'll average those and pick the center of that quad. So the reason for doing that is, let's say for example I've got the grid on, then I just move that pivot object around, the center of it's going to snap to the grid, so then when I use that as the pivot, it will use that snap grid location as the pivot, if that's how I want to position the pivot. So let's just leave it there. So I'll show you how that works now. I'll pick all these shells, so that includes the pivot object and those shells. Now when I rotate it, it's rotating around the center of that pivot object. If I want to move it, I just click the left mouse button to unselect, move that over here, select them again. So there's my new pivot location. So I can place that anywhere. I should just mention, if I move it here, you see it disappears. Reason for that is when I created the pivot layer, by default it's just underneath everything else, so I need to have pivot layer selected, oops, select the pivot layer and move that up. So now the pivot layer is above all the other layers, so now you can see it. So let's say I want to position it there. Again, everything rotates around the center of that pivot object. Alright, so that's great. Let's say I then change my view to somewhere else, and I'm not really sure where that pivot object's gone. The easiest way to sort of find that or retrieve it is to just, again, click the left mouse button here somewhere so that nothing's selected. Click that button there next to pivot, so now the pivot object is selected, and I can use Shift M. So Shift M will move, Shift M is the magnet hotkey, so it will move all selected shells to where the mouse pointer is. So I can just, again, move that wherever. Just move the mouse pointer somewhere and the pivot will go there. And then I can just move it around somewhere else if I want, select these shells, and it will pivot around that object. Alright, so that's basically showing you how to set up a pivot object. That pivot.obj file can be reused now. I don't need to go through that process of creating it. I'll still have to import it though. Just finally, let's say I don't want to use the pivot object as my pivot for some reason. What you should do then is just hide. So that's this button here, that will hide the pivot layer. So now, because that's hidden, it's not using that as the pivot, it's just using the center of those shells. Again, if over here, it's ignoring the pivot object. If I bring the pivot object back, again, it's not rotating around the pivot because I haven't selected that, so I just have to click on that button and then that pivot layer is selected, so then it's active now. So that's how you can temporarily turn the pivot on and off. And then finally, to save my scene out there, save the mesh out, if I don't want the pivot object in there, then just click this button here. That will select everything except the pivot layer. And then when I go save marked up here, it will save everything out to its own file without the pivot object in it. Okay, so that's the sort of workaround in the current version for how to set up a pivot object. In the next release of UVLayout, it'll be a bit easier. I'll just set up some toggle here to show a pivot object that you can move around. But this is the current workaround.